Welcome. Find a comfortable position and allow yourself to settle in. Tonight, we journey to a different time, to a different shore, to the early years of the American Republic, when the young nation's coastline stretched dark and treacherous, and lonely towers of light stood sentinel against the consuming sea. Imagine yourself transported back to the early 1800s, to a time when the concept of America itself was still taking shape, still finding its footing. The country was young, its maritime commerce vital, its coastal waters both pathway and peril. And along these shores, in isolated stations buffeted by wind and salt spray, lighthouse keepers maintained their quiet vigil. These were not adventures filled with dramatic rescues or spectacular storms, though such moments did occur. Rather, this was a life defined by routine, by patience, by the gentle rhythm of maintenance and watchkeeping. It was a life of solitude and duty, of oil lamps and logbooks, of endless horizons, and the constant companionship of the sea. Tonight, we explore this quiet existence. We will walk through their days, understand their world, and drift alongside the steady turning of their light. Let the waves beyond your imagination carry you backward through time, and let the gentle constancy of their labor ease you toward rest. The day begins before dawn. You wake in darkness, the small keeper's quarters still holding the chill of the November night. The room is simple: a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a small table, a trunk containing your few possessions. Through the single window, you can see nothing yet but the faint gray promise of morning over the Atlantic, that vast expanse that defines your entire existence here. You rise without ceremony. The floor is cold beneath your feet, rough wooden planks that creak softly as you move. There is no rushing, for rushing serves no purpose in this life. Everything here operates according to a rhythm as steady and unchanging as the tides themselves. Your first task, as it is every morning, is to climb the tower and tend to the light. The spiral staircase winds upward through the stone cylinder, each step worn smooth by countless ascents and descents. Your hand trails along the cool wall as you climb, steadying yourself in the darkness. You have made this climb so many times that your feet know each step, each slight irregularity in the stone. The lamp room awaits at the top, its glass panels revealing the first pale wash of dawn across the water. The lamp itself a collection of whale oil reservoirs and argon burners, backed by a parabolic reflector, has been burning through the night, and now you must extinguish it. You turn the mechanism carefully, feeling the weight of responsibility in this simple act. To extinguish too early means vessels might lose their bearing in those dangerous pre-dawn hours when the sky tricks the eye. To leave it burning too long wastes precious oil. You gauge the light. The eastern horizon shows that subtle distinction between sea and sky that tells an experienced keeper the sun will soon breach the water's edge. You extinguish the lamp. The sudden absence of flame creates a momentary void, a silence beyond the usual silence. And then the natural sounds of morning reassert themselves. The cry of gulls, the endless conversation of waves against rocks below. Now begins the cleaning. You remove the glass chimneys from each burner with practiced care. They are warm still and fragile, and absolutely irreplaceable without weeks of waiting for new ones to arrive from Boston or Philadelphia. You wipe away the carbon deposits with a soft cloth, gentle circular motions that leave no streaks, no imperfections. The glass must be perfectly clear, for even a slight film diminishes the light's reach, and that reach, that penetration of darkness, is the entire reason for your existence here. The brass components require polishing. You apply the polish with another cloth, working it into the metal until it gleams. There is something meditative in this work, something almost satisfying in the transformation from dull to brilliant. Your movements are slow, methodical. There is no benefit to haste and much risk. A dropped chimney, a scratched reflector, these small disasters could have profound consequences for vessels navigating in darkness. While you work, the sun rises properly, flooding the lamp room with golden light. The ocean stretches before you in all directions, a shifting plain of gray-blue that extends to the curve of the earth itself. On clear mornings like this, you can see perhaps 15 miles in any direction. The isolation is absolute. A nearest village lies 8 miles up the coast, accessible only by a narrow track that becomes impassable mud during rain, or by boat when the sea permits. You scan the horizon as you clean, a habit so ingrained you perform it without conscious thought. They're perhaps 6 miles out a merchant vessel, likely heading to New York or Philadelphia, its sails catching the morning light. You watch it for a moment, imagining the life aboard, the purposes that drive men to cross this vast and indifferent water. Then you return to your work. The cleaning complete, you descend the tower. The keeper's dwelling awaits, and with it, the matter of breakfast. Your provisions are simple and largely unchanging: salted pork, dried beans, flour, cornmeal, molasses, tea. Fresh food is a rarity here, dependent on trips to the mainland or the irregular visits of the supply vessel. You have a small garden plot during the warmer months, coaxing vegetables from the thin coastal soil, but November offers no such bounty. You prepare a simple meal: cornmeal mush, a slice of salt pork fried in its own fat, weak tea. The small wood stove radiates welcome warmth as you cook, taking the edge off the morning chill. You eat slowly, sitting at the small table, your only companion the ticking of the clock on the wall. This clock is perhaps your most valued possession, for your entire routine depends on its accuracy. The light must be kindled at precisely the right moment each evening, and extinguished at precisely the right moment each morning. After breakfast, you attend to the day's chores. There are always chores, an endless succession of small tasks that maintain this station against the relentless assault of salt air and weather. Today, you notice that several shingles on the storage shed have loosened in the recent storms. You gather your tools, hammer, nails, a pry bar, and set about repairs. The wind blows constantly here, a presence as fundamental as the ocean itself. Even on calm days, there is movement in the air, a steady pressure from the sea that pushes against everything, wearing away at exposed surfaces with patient inevitability. You have learned to work with this wind, to brace yourself against it when necessary, to move in harmony with its rhythms rather than fighting it. The repair work takes the better part of 2 hours. Each nail must be driven carefully, the hammer blows measured and precise. A nail driven poorly splits the wood, and wood is too precious to waste. You have a limited supply stored in the shed, and the next delivery may not come for weeks, or in winter, for months. As you work, you notice the subtle changes in the sky. High, thin clouds have begun to streak across the blue, and the wind has shifted slightly, now coming more from the northeast. You file these observations away mentally. Weather prediction is not an exact science in these years of the early republic, but you have learned to read the signs, to anticipate the ocean's moods. That shift in wind direction, combined with those particular clouds, suggests unsettled weather within the next day or two. The midday meal is even simpler than breakfast bread you baked 2 days ago, now growing hard, softened by dunking it in tea. A few dried apples from your stores. You eat standing at the window, looking out at the sea. The merchant vessel you spotted this morning has disappeared beyond the horizon. The ocean appears empty now, a vast expanse without human presence, though you know this appearance is deceptive. Somewhere beyond your vision, vessels move, commerce flows, lives unfold in patterns entirely separate from your own. Afternoon brings more maintenance. You check the oil supply, performing calculations in your head. So many gallons remaining, so many nights of burning. The next scheduled resupply still 2 weeks away, if weather permits. The numbers are adequate, but not generous. You make a note in your log to burn conservatively, perhaps reducing the number of burners on nights with clear visibility. The logbook sits on a small desk in the keeper's quarters, and you spend time each afternoon updating it. The entries are precise and factual. Wind direction, weather conditions, vessels sighted, oil consumed, maintenance performed. This log serves as your official record, proof of your diligence, evidence that you fulfill the duties for which the government pays your modest salary, perhaps $400 annually, a sum that must support not only yourself but for many keepers, a family. You are fortunate, in one sense, to be alone here. Some lighthouse stations accommodate a keeper's wife and children, and the isolation bears on families in ways both obvious and subtle. Children grow restless. Wives grow weary of the endless sameness, the absence of society, the constant anxiety about storms and supply. You have only yourself to manage, only your own mind to occupy through the long hours. The afternoon passes in this manner: small tasks, careful observations, the steady progression toward evening. You split firewood, replenish the kindling box, check the mechanism that rotates the light. For some of the more sophisticated lighthouse installations have begun incorporating rotating apparatus, though yours remains fixed. You inspect the tower's exterior, noting a place where mortar has crumbled between stones, marking it for repair when weather permits. As the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, you prepare for the evening's primary task, the lighting of the lamp. This ritual begins well before sunset, for the lamp requires time to reach full brilliance. You climb the tower once more, carrying a small can of whale oil to top off the reservoirs. The whale oil flows thick and pale, with a particular scent that has become for you, inseparable from this life. You pour carefully, watching the level rise in each reservoir. The mechanism that feeds oil to the burners is simple, but must be maintained with absolute precision. A clog in the feed line, an air bubble in the system. These small failures can extinguish the light, and an extinguished light means vessels lost, lives ended in the darkness. You clean the wicks next, trimming away the charred portions with small scissors designed for this purpose. Each wick must be precisely the right length. Too short, and the flame burns weak. Too long, and it smokes, fouling the glass. You have performed this task thousands of times, and your hands move with unconscious expertise. The light outside begins to fade. The ocean takes on that particular quality it has in the hour before dark, a deepening of color, a sense of the water gathering itself for night. You strike the first match, touch it to the first wick. The flame catches, grows, steadies. You adjust the airflow, watching the flame's shape and color. When it burns just so, not too high, not too low, a steady yellow glow, you move to the next burner. One by one, the lamps kindle. The parabolic reflector behind them captures and focuses the light, sending it out across the water in a concentrated beam. You stand back and observe your work. The lamp room glows warm and bright, a small chamber of light suspended above the darkening sea. From the water, you know, this light will be visible for miles, a steady beacon marking the dangerous rocks that lie submerged a quarter-mile offshore. Your evening meal is taken cold leftover mush from the morning, more bread, a piece of dried fish. You eat quickly and without ceremony, for during the night hours you must check the lamp regularly, ensuring it continues to burn. These checks occur every few hours, and between them you attempt what rest you can, though it is never deep sleep, never the full abandonment of consciousness that you knew in your previous life, before you came to this isolated tower. The first check occurs at 9 o'clock. You climb the tower, observe the flames, add oil where necessary, adjust a wick that has begun to smoke slightly. The night outside is fully dark now, the ocean invisible except where moonlight catches the tops of waves. The light from your tower seems impossibly fragile in all this darkness, a small human assertion against vast natural indifference. You return to your quarters and attempt to read by candlelight an old volume of sermons you have read many times before. The words blur together, familiar and meaningless. Your mind wanders. You think about the life you left behind, the reasons that brought you to this work. Perhaps it was financial necessity, For lighthouse keeping, while isolated, offers steady employment in uncertain times. Perhaps it was a desire for solitude, a temperament suited to long hours alone with your thoughts. Perhaps it was simply chance, an advertisement seen, an application made, an appointment received. A midnight check comes too soon and not soon enough. Time moves strangely here, both sluggish and swift. You climb once more, tend the flame, scan the empty ocean. A distant light on the horizon, another vessel, or perhaps another lighthouse far down the coast. The sight of it creates a strange feeling, a reminder that others maintain this same vigil, that you are part of a network of solitary watchers, each keeping your separate lights burning through the darkness. The night deepens. You doze in the chair by the stove, starting awake at intervals, checking the clock, climbing the tower when required. 3 o'clock, the darkest hour. The oil has burned low in 2 of the reservoirs, and you refill them, your movements slow with fatigue. The cold has intensified, and even the lamp room offers little warmth, the heat rising and dissipating through the ventilation grills, designed to prevent dangerous buildup of fumes. At 5:30, you make the final check before dawn. The eastern horizon shows no light yet, but you know from long experience that it will soon come. You adjust the wicks one last time, ensuring they will burn steady through the final hour of darkness. Your work for this night is nearly done. The rhythm of these days and nights forms the foundation of your existence. There is no variation, no disruption, no fundamental change from one day to the next. In winter, the cold intensifies, the storms grow more violent, the isolation more complete when ice closes the harbor and snow buries the narrow track to the mainland. In summer, the work grows different in detail, but not in essence. The same light to tend, the same watch to keep, the same endless horizon to scan. You have learned to find sufficiency in small things. The flight pattern of a passing bird, the particular shade of pink that sometimes colors the dawn clouds, the taste of truly fresh water when the supply boat finally arrives. These minor pleasures sustain you through the monotony, provide texture to days that might otherwise blur together into undifferentiated sameness. The isolation works on the mind in subtle ways. You find yourself talking aloud sometimes, narrating your actions to an invisible listener. You assign personalities to the gulls that frequent the rocks below. This one bold and aggressive, that one timid, the third clever and patient. You develop elaborate theories about the vessels you see passing, inventing entire stories about their cargoes, their destinations, the lives of those aboard. There are worse occupations, you remind yourself. In the growing cities of the Republic, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and work in conditions you can barely imagine. Crowded manufactories where the air grows thick with cotton fibers or coal dust. Shipyards where accidents claim lives with grim regularity. Docks where cargo handlers labor from dawn to dusk for wages that barely sustain life. Here, at least, you have clean air, adequate food, shelter, and the strange dignity of solitude. The autumn days grow shorter as November progresses toward December. The angle of sunlight changes, becomes more oblique, less warming. You light the lamp earlier each evening, extinguish it later each morning. The wood pile diminishes, and you wonder whether your supply will last through the winter, or whether you will need to venture to the mainland for more, assuming the weather and sea conditions permit. One afternoon, you spot a fishing vessel closer to shore than usual, close enough that you can see the figures of men moving on its deck. They wave, and you wave back, a simple exchange of acknowledgement across the water. It is the closest thing to social interaction you have experienced in weeks. The vessel moves on, and you watch it until it rounds the headland and disappears, leaving you once more alone with sea and sky and the patient turning of hours. The work continues. Each day brings the same tasks in the same order. Wake in darkness, tend the light, clean the apparatus, perform maintenance, record observations, prepare simple meals, light the lamp, as darkness falls. Check it through the night. The pattern repeats with the reliability of the tides themselves, and you move through it with the detachment of long practice. This is the life of a lighthouse keeper in the early American Republic, not dramatic, not adventurous, but essential nonetheless. Somewhere in the darkness, your light guides vessels safely past danger. Lives continue because you maintain your watch. Commerce flows because you keep the flame burning. And in the quiet discipline of this routine, in the steady fulfillment of this duty, there exists a kind of purpose, a kind of meaning, humble though it may be. Let us now turn our attention to one particular keeper, one particular life, unfolding along the shores of Martha's Vineyard in the earliest years of the American Republic. His story illuminates not only the individual experience of lighthouse keeping, but also the broader transformation of coastal navigation in the young nation. Ebenezer, skiff arrives at Gay Head on the western tip of Martha's Vineyard in the autumn of 1799. He is appointed by President John Adams himself, selected through correspondence that passes between the President and the Treasury Department. For in these early years, lighthouse appointments remain federal matters of some significance. The position carries a salary of $200 annually, a modest but reliable income in an era when economic stability eludes many. Skiff becomes, upon his arrival, the first white settler to establish permanent residence in the town of Gay Head, a community predominantly inhabited by the Wampanoag people who have occupied this land for generations. The isolation of his position is thus doubled separated, not only by geography from the broader world of the new republic, but also by culture and language from his immediate neighbors. Yet relationships develop, connections form. In time, Skiff will serve as a teacher for the local children, offering instruction in reading and arithmetic, adding this duty to his lighthouse responsibilities without additional compensation. The lighthouse itself, a structure of wood and brick rising from the clay cliffs that give Gay Head its name, represents something larger than its physical dimensions. It embodies the young nation's assertion of order upon the maritime chaos that has claimed vessels and lives along these shores for as long as men have sailed these waters. To understand Skiff's appointment, we must step back a decade to 1789, to the first session of the First United States Congress convening in New York City's Federal Hall. Among the many acts of that historic session, the inauguration of George Washington, the establishment of the Treasury Congress, creates the United States Lighthouse Establishment, transferring ownership of 12 colonial-era lighthouses from state control to federal authority. The responsibility for administering these lights and for constructing new ones falls to the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton approaches the task with characteristic thoroughness. He understands that maritime commerce forms the lifeblood of the new nation's economy, that ships lost to storms or hidden rocks represent not merely personal tragedies, but national economic losses. The expansion of the lighthouse system becomes one of his priorities, a public works initiative that will eventually span the entire coastline. The Cape Henry Lighthouse in Virginia, authorized by Washington and overseen by Hamilton, becomes the first federally funded lighthouse, its construction beginning in 1792. Other projects follow Cape Hatteras, commissioned in 1794, though not completed until 1803. And in 1799, the lighthouse at Gay Head, where Ebenezer's skiff now finds himself keeper of a light that represents the federal government's commitment to safe navigation. On November 18, 1799, Skiff climbs the wooden stairs of his tower for the first time in his official capacity. In his hands, he carries flint and steel. The lamp awaiting him is what the era terms spider lamp, a shallow circular pan filled with sperm whale oil, multiple wicks arranged around its circumference like the legs of that eight-legged creature. The technology is ancient, barely evolved from methods used for centuries, but it is what the nation can afford, what the available appropriations permit. He strikes the flint, sparks catch. The first wick ignites, then the second, the third, working his way around the pan until all burns steadily. The Gay Head light enters service, its glow visible across the waters that separate Martha's Vineyard from the mainland, its beam reaching toward vessels navigating between Buzzards Bay and the open Atlantic. The work proves more arduous than Skiff anticipates. The spider lamp consumes whale oil prodigiously, requiring constant attention and frequent refilling. The glass panels that surround the light essential for protecting the flame from wind while allowing the light to pass accumulate a film of smudge from the burning oil. Each morning brings the labor of cleaning, the careful wiping away of residue that, if left to accumulate, would dim the light to uselessness. Imagine Skiff's routine in those first years. The climb at dusk with the oil can, heavy and awkward. The careful lighting of each wick, ensuring an even burn. The checks through the night, every few hours rising from inadequate sleep to verify that the flame continues. That wind has not extinguished a wick, that oil levels remain adequate. Then dawn, and the extinguishing and the cleaning that must be performed regardless of weather, regardless of how little sleep the night has permitted. The seasons turn. Winter brings storms that batter the exposed clay cliffs, winds that seem to penetrate every gap in the lighthouse structure. Skiff learns to anticipate the weather, to stock extra oil before storms isolate the station, to secure loose items before gales arrive. Summer offers gentler conditions, but brings its own challenges. The increased shipping traffic means more vessels depending on its light, more responsibility weighing on the simple act of keeping wicks trimmed and oil reservoirs filled. The years accumulate slowly. 1,800, 1,805, 1810. The nation around him transforms. Louisiana Purchase doubles the country's size. The War of 1812 tests its survival. Westward expansion begins its inexorable push. But at Gay Head, the rhythm remains essentially unchanged. Light the lamp, tend the flame, keep the glass clean, watch the horizon, record the weather, mark the passing vessels in the log. After several years, Skiff petitions for an increase in salary, explaining that the labor exceeds what he originally understood, that the meager $200 proves barely adequate. The response from the Treasury Department, when it finally arrives after months of waiting, acknowledges his service, but offers little financial relief. The workings of the federal bureaucracy move with glacial slowness, and lighthouse keepers, isolated on their remote stations, possess little leverage to press their claims. Yet Skiff persists. He remains at his post through 1815, through 1820, into the 1820s. 29 years he will serve at Gay Head, an almost incomprehensible span of dedication to a single duty in a single place. The isolation that might drive another man to abandon his post becomes for Skiff simply the accepted condition of existence. The clay cliffs, the crashing surf, the turning seasons, the nightly lighting of the lamp, these elements compose the entirety of his world. Consider what 29 years means. A child born the year Skiff arrives at Gay Head, grows to full adulthood, perhaps marries, perhaps has children of their own, all while Skiff climbs the same stairs, lights the same lamp, watches the same stretch of ocean. Administrations change in Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams, but the work at Gay Head continues unchanged. Technologies evolve elsewhere. The nation industrializes. Cities grow and populations shift westward. But at the lighthouse, the spider lamp burns as it always has, requiring the same patient attention it demanded in 1799. The Wampanoag community surrounding the lighthouse observes this strange white man who lives among them, who climbs his tower each evening, who teaches their children during the day. Perhaps they appreciate his steadiness, his reliability, his apparent contentment with a life that most would find unbearably monotonous. Perhaps they recognize in his patient devotion to duty something that transcends cultural difference, a commitment to protecting life, to maintaining a light that guides not only white sailors, but all who venture onto these waters. By 1828, Skiff has aged into his role completely. He is no longer a young man accepting an appointment. He is the lighthouse itself, inseparable from his function. When he finally retires, or perhaps when age finally forces his departure, his son Ellis assumes the position, continuing the family's association with Gay Head Light. The younger Skiff will serve 17 years more, earning a higher salary of $350 annually, a sum that reflects both increased national prosperity and perhaps belated recognition of the work's demanding nature. Ebenezer Skiff's story contains no dramatic rescues, no spectacular heroism, no moments that would merit newspaper coverage or official commendations. It is instead a story of quiet persistence, of duty fulfilled day after day, year after year, across nearly 3 decades. In its very ordinariness lies something profound, a testament to the countless individuals who maintain the infrastructure of civilization, who perform necessary work without recognition, whose daily labor enables others to travel safely, to conduct commerce, to return home to their families. The lighthouse he tended still stands, though greatly modified from the structure Skiff knew. The spider lamp gave way to more sophisticated lighting systems. The original wooden portions were replaced. Automation eventually eliminated the need for a resident keeper at all. But in 1799, when Skiff first lit those wicks, when the federal government was barely a decade old, when the concept of a unified coastal navigation system was still being imagined and implemented, his work mattered absolutely. He represents something larger than himself. He represents all the keepers who accepted isolation, who endured monotony, who fulfilled their duty in darkness and in storm, who kept the lights burning. Without them, the young republic's maritime commerce would have foundered on unseen rocks, would have shattered in darkness on invisible shores. They were the quiet guardians, the patient watchers, the keepers of light in an age when darkness still held dominion over most of the world's hours. And so Ebenezer Skiff climbs his tower, night after night, year after year, for 29 years. He lights the spider lamp, he tends the flame, he keeps the glass clean, he watches for vessels in distress, he records the weather, he teaches local children their letters. He lives his life in service to a light, and through that service, he participates in something greater than himself, the slow, patient construction of a nation's infrastructure, one lighthouse at a time, one night at a time, one trimmed wick at a time. The work continues beyond him. Other keepers follow. Other lights are built. The system expands and evolves. But in those early years of the American Republic, when everything remained uncertain, when the nation's survival was not yet guaranteed, men like Ebenezer Skiff kept their solitary vigils. They asked for little. They endured much. And they kept the lights burning. We turn now to the physical remnants of this vanished world, to the objects that lighthouse keepers handled daily, and to the written traces they left behind. In the earth surrounding old lighthouse foundations, in museum archives, and in the pages of carefully preserved logbooks, we find the material evidence of lives lived in service to light. When archaeologists excavate the grounds of early American lighthouse sites, they uncover layers of daily existence preserved in soil and sediment. At the Chiffunct River Lighthouse site in Louisiana, researchers discovered bone buttons, pottery fragments, and alongside them intriguingly stone tools and points that speak to earlier inhabitants of the same coastal landscape. Among the finds, a hand-painted pottery sherb bearing a Dutch maritime motif, perhaps a fragment from a keeper's personal dish, carried to this remote station, and eventually broken, discarded, absorbed back into the earth. At North Point in Wisconsin, the search for the original 1855 Lighthouse Foundation became a detective story unfolding across years. Volunteers and archaeologists worked from old deed descriptions recorded in 19th century legal language, attempting to translate metes and bounds measurements into modern coordinates. They employed ground-penetrating radar, sending invisible pulses into the soil. Reading the echoes that returned when those pulses encountered something solid beneath the surface stone, brick, the rectangular void of a filled cellar. The excavations that followed yielded cream city brick, that distinctive pale yellow building material produced in Milwaukee from the region's clay deposits. The bricks lay scattered where the lighthouse had been demolished, each one a small piece of a structure that once stood complete, functional, inhabited. Mixed among the demolition debris fragments of glass, rusted iron nails, pieces of ceramic that might once have been oil lamp components, or simply domestic crockery. These artifacts speak in quiet voices about the texture of daily life. The bone buttons suggest clothing mended and remended, worn until it could no longer be repaired. The pottery sherds indicate meals prepared and consumed, the same simple foods day after day, eaten from plates that eventually chipped and cracked. The bricks themselves, each one molded, fired, transported to this remote location, mortared into place by hands now centuries gone, represent the physical infrastructure of isolation. Consider what these objects mean. A button, perhaps the size of a coin, made from animal bone, drilled with 4 holes for thread. It secured the front of a keeper's shirt or coat, fastened and unfastened countless times as he dressed for the cold climb to the lamp room, as he removed layers when returning to the warmth of the dwelling. One day it fell, perhaps noticed, perhaps not. It rolled into a corner, was swept aside, migrated slowly into the soil, and there it waited, a century or more, until archaeologists' careful trowels exposed it once again to daylight. The lighthouse keeper's logbooks that survive in archives represent another form of archaeology, an archaeology of words, of daily notations that accumulate into a portrait of existence. The National Archives holds logbooks beginning in 1872, though earlier records exist in scattered collections, maintained before formal regulations standardized their keeping. James Donahue, keeper of the South Haven Lighthouse on Lake Michigan, maintained his logbook with meticulous attention through the 1870s. His entries follow a rhythm weather observations, wind direction, lake conditions, vessels sighted, maintenance performed. The handwriting flows in steady cursive across the pages, the ink now faded to brown, the paper brittle with age. August 1874. Routine observations, temperatures, wind speeds, the names of schooners entering the harbor. September brings similar entries. October continues the pattern. The year turns, and still the entries come, day after day, a written testimony to the constancy of duty. Then, on July 3, 1875, Donahue writes, "Rain and cloudy, wind moderate, lake smooth, the night dark. The weather warm. My wife died this afternoon at 4 p.m. of lung disease." The words sit on the page with devastating simplicity. After the weather observations, after the wind direction, the notation of death, stated as fact, recorded, because all significant events at the station must be recorded. The next day's entry continues in the same hand. Foggy wind, the fog thick all day. The lake smooth, the night dark. I buried my wife today at 4 p.m. The misspelling of buried speaks perhaps to grief, or perhaps simply to limited formal education, or perhaps to the way language sometimes fails in the face of profound loss. But the entry exists. The light was tended. The watch continued. On the evening of July 4th, Donahue climbed the tower and lit the lamp, as he had done the evening before, as he would do the evening after. This is what the logbooks reveal, not just the mechanics of lighthouse operation, but the human cost of duty, the way personal tragedy and professional responsibility existed not in separate spheres, but intermixed, inseparable. The keepers wrote in these books because regulations required it, but in their brief, factual notations, they left traces of their inner lives, of losses endured, of persistence in the face of circumstances that might justify abandoning one's post. Other entries record different dramas. Shipwrecks observed from the tower, vessels driven onto rocks or sandbars, sometimes with all hands saved, sometimes with all hands lost. The keepers noted the names of ships, the fate of crews, the weather conditions that contributed to disaster. Fay is a report that the schooner DG begins one entry, the sentence trailing off into information now lost to time. The logbooks also capture moments of what we might call sociability, if that word can apply to encounters in such isolated circumstances. Donahue noted the names of vessel owners, the comings and goings of commerce, the occasional pleasure craft passing through the harbor. Each notation represents contact with the broader world, proof that the lighthouse stood not in complete isolation, but at a point of connection, a place where the rhythms of commerce and the requirements of navigation intersected. The material culture of lighthouse keeping centered on the technology of illumination itself, the lamps, the fuel, the countless components that transformed liquid oil into visible light. In the early American Republic, this meant whale oil and the apparatus designed to burn it efficiently. Whale oil comes from the blubber of whales, rendered, that is, heated until the fat liquefies and can be separated from other tissue. The New England whaling industry, centered in ports like New Bedford and Nantucket, supplied the nation's lighthouses through the mid-19th century. Ships departed on voyages lasting months or years, pursuing sperm whales across vast stretches of ocean. The whales, once harpooned and killed, were processed at sea, their blubber stripped away and boiled in great iron trypots, the resulting oil stored in barrels in the ship's hold. This oil possessed qualities that made it ideal for lighthouse use. It burned cleanly, with minimal smoke when properly maintained. It remained liquid at temperatures that would congeal other oils. It provided steady, reliable light. The supply was relatively abundant in the early 19th century, before overhunting depleted whale populations and drove prices prohibitively high. A lighthouse keeper received deliveries of this oil in barrels or large cans. He stored it in a separate building, a necessary precaution, for oil represented both valuable commodity and fire hazard. Each evening, when preparing to light the lamp, he carried a smaller container of oil to the tower, climbed the stairs, and poured it carefully into the lamp's reservoirs. The lamp itself evolved through various designs across the early 19th century. The simplest version, the spider lamp, consisted of a shallow pan with multiple wicks radiating from the center, hence the name. More sophisticated designs employed argon burners, which used a hollow cylindrical wick and a glass chimney to create better airflow and thus a brighter, cleaner flame. Imagine the keeper's hands performing this work. The feel of the oilkin, heavy and awkward. The careful pouring, watching the level rise in each reservoir, making certain not to overfill, for spilled oil created both waste and danger. The trimming of wicks with small scissors, the precise cutting away of charred portions. The striking of the match, the moment when flame caught, the adjustment of airflow until the flame burned with exactly the right character. The glass components required constant attention. Smoke residue accumulated on the interior surfaces of lamp chimneys and on the glass panels that enclosed the lamp room. Each morning brought the labor of cleaning soft cloths applied with gentle pressure, circular motions that removed the film without scratching the glass. A keeper who neglected this duty soon found his light diminished, its reach shortened, its effectiveness compromised. The brass reflectors behind the lamp's parabolic, curves designed to capture and focus the light needed regular polishing. Oxidation dulled the metal, reducing its reflective capacity. A keeper applied polish, worked it in with one cloth, buffed it away with another, transforming tarnished brass into gleaming mirror-bright surface. This work, like so much of lighthouse keeping, was repetitive, tedious, essential. By mid-century, whale oil began giving way to alternative fuels as whale populations declined and prices increased. Lard oil rendered from pig fat became the lighthouse board's preferred substitute for a time, though it required higher temperatures to remain liquid and produced more smoke. Later came kerosene, which burned brighter and cleaner, but also more dangerously. Each fuel change required keepers to learn new techniques, to adjust their methods, to adapt their long-practiced routines to altered circumstances. Maritime culture carried with it a rich tradition of superstition and folklore, beliefs that emerged from long exposure to the sea's dangers and unpredictabilities. Lighthouse keepers, living at the boundary between land and ocean, participated in this tradition while developing their own particular customs. St. Elmo's fire, the electrical discharge that sometimes appeared at the top of ship masts during storms, held complex meaning for sailors. Some viewed it as protection, a sign of divine favor. Others saw it as an omen of danger, for it indicated electrical activity in the atmosphere and could interfere with compass readings. Lighthouse keepers, watching storms from their towers, sometimes observed similar phenomena, glowing coronas around the lightning rods that protected their structures. The customs and small rituals that keepers developed often related to the fundamental anxieties of their work: fear of the light failing, fear of vessels lost due to negligence, fear of the isolation that could erode mental stability. A keeper might perform his tasks in precisely the same order each evening, not because regulations required this specific sequence, but because routine itself provided comfort, created a framework of normalcy within the abnormal conditions of lighthouse life. The rule against intoxication, formalized in 1852 regulations, carried severe penalties: immediate dismissal for any keeper discovered drinking. This rule recognized the particular dangers of alcohol in isolated environments, the way it could impair judgment when judgment mattered absolutely, the way it could offer temporary escape from monotony, while ultimately intensifying the problems it seemed to solve. Keepers were forbidden to leave their stations, except to draw pay or attend Sunday religious services, and even then, only with written permission. This restriction acknowledged the fundamental nature of their duty. The light must always be maintained. The watch must always be kept. To leave was to break faith, to place vessels and lives at risk. Some keepers served for decades without traveling more than a few miles from their towers, their entire worlds contracting to the compass of visible horizon. Some lighthouse mysteries remain unsolved, though they mostly belong to other shores and later eras. The disappearance of 3 keepers from Scotland's Flannan Isle Lighthouse in December 1900 has generated theories ranging from plausible to fantastical. The likely explanation, that the men were swept away by waves while attempting to secure equipment during a storm, speaks to the real dangers that keepers faced, the way routine maintenance could turn suddenly fatal. But the American lighthouses of the early Republic offer their own quieter mysteries. What became of the countless private notebooks and diaries that keepers might have kept, separate from official logs? What thoughts occupied their minds during the long hours of darkness? What dreams sustained them? What regrets haunted them? What small joys they discovered in their constrained circumstances? The artifacts offer partial answers. The buttons and pottery sherds, the logbook entries, the carefully maintained lamp components, these objects speak to dedication, to patience, to the capacity of human beings to create meaning, even in monotonous circumstances. They testify to lives lived largely in obscurity, remembered now only through the fragmentary traces they left behind. And yet these traces suffice. Through them we understand something essential about the early American Republic, that it was built not only through grand political gestures and dramatic military victories, but also through countless small acts of duty performed in isolation by ordinary individuals who kept their lights burning, night after night, year after year, decade after decade. The archaeology continues. More lighthouse sites await excavation. More logbooks wait in archives for researchers to examine them. More stories will emerge from the material record, adding detail to our understanding of this vanished way of life. But already we know enough to appreciate what these keepers accomplished, and at what cost to themselves they accomplished it. While lighthouse keepers maintained their solitary vigils on distant shores, a different America unfolded in the cities and towns of the young republic. In Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, merchant families accumulated fortunes through international trade. constructing lives of increasing refinement and social complexity. The contrast between these two Americas, one of isolation and routine, the other of society and commerce, reveals the profound social divisions that characterized the early national period. Consider a merchant family in Boston during these years, perhaps the Perkins family, or the Forbes, or any of the interrelated clans who formed what Oliver Wendell Holmes would later term the Boston Brahmins. Their wealth derived from trade, from vessels that crossed oceans, carrying manufactured goods to foreign ports, and returning with exotic commodities, tea, silk, porcelain, and less savory cargoes that generated enormous profits. The merchant's day began not with the lighting of whale oil lamps, but with the arrival of domestic servants, who had already been at work for hours. In urban middle-class and wealthy households, the labor of maintaining a home devolved onto hired help young women from the countryside seeking employment, or in some cases, enslaved individuals whose servitude followed them into northern cities despite gradual emancipation laws. These servants rose before dawn, kindled fires in multiple hearths throughout the house, carried water from wells or cisterns, prepared breakfast in kitchens that bore little resemblance to the simple cooking arrangements of a lighthouse keeper's dwelling. A wealthy household might employ several servants, each with specific duties: a cook, a laundress, a lady's maid, a man to tend the horses and maintain the carriage. The merchant himself awoke to a prepared room, warmed by fires he did not light, to face a day structured not by the rising and setting sun, but by the rhythms of commerce and society. After breakfast, a meal considerably more elaborate than salt pork and cornmeal, he departed for his counting house, the nerve center of his trading operations. Here, in rooms filled with ledgers and correspondence, surrounded by clerks who managed the vast documentation required for international trade, the merchant tracked his vessel's movements, calculated profits and losses, arranged financing, negotiated contracts. His concerns were global: the price of tea in Canton, the availability of credit in London, political upheavals in South America that might affect trade routes. The wealth generated by this commerce transformed into physical comfort and social prestige. The merchant's house stood several stories tall, filled with rooms designated for specific purposes: parlors for receiving guests, dining rooms for formal meals, private chambers for family members, servants' quarters tucked away in attics or basements, fine furniture imported from England, silverware bearing family crests, china painted with delicate patterns, carpets from Persia. These objects filled the rooms, material evidence of commercial success. The merchant's wife, mistress of this household, occupied herself with duties entirely unlike those of a lighthouse keeper. She supervised the servants, planned menus, managed household accounts, received social calls from other ladies of her class, oversaw the education and moral development of her children. Her labor was real, though very different from the physical toil of farm women or the relentless maintenance performed by isolated keepers. In southern households of similar wealth, enslaved people performed virtually all domestic labor. Cooks prepared elaborate meals, nurses tended white children, maids cleaned and laundered, butlers served at table. The plantation mistress directed this workforce, teaching skills, assigning tasks, managing the complex household economy that sustained both the white family and the enslaved community. These enslaved house servants often bore a double burden: maintaining the big house while also caring for their own families in the slave quarters, cooking their own meals, sewing their own clothes, all after completing their assigned duties. Some rose to positions of considerable skill and responsibility, becoming expert cooks or trusted personal attendants, though always within the fundamental horror of their bondage. The social calendar. The elite of the early republic structured time not by tides and lamplighting schedules, but by an elaborate social calendar. Balls, assemblies, and private gatherings created a rhythm of entertainment and social networking, quite alien to the experience of isolated keepers. In cities and larger towns, assembly rooms hosted public balls where the young people of respectable families gathered to dance, to see and be seen, to form the connections that might lead to advantageous marriages. A master of ceremonies oversaw these events, managing introductions with careful attention to family background and social standing, ensuring that propriety prevailed throughout the evening. The dances themselves, country dances, and later, the fashionable quadrilles imported from Europe, could continue for hours. Couples moved through prescribed patterns, the music provided by hired musicians, the floors polished to smoothness, the rooms lit by hundreds of candles. Between dances, refreshments were served: punch, wine, elaborate confections that demonstrated the host's wealth and hospitality. Private balls held at country estates or urban mansions offered even more luxurious entertainment. Dancing might begin at 11 o'clock at night and continue until dawn. Supper was served at midnight or later, consisting of multiple courses soups, roasted meats, fish, game birds, vegetables both common and exotic, elaborate desserts, including fresh pineapples grown in heated glasshouses and transported to the city at considerable expense. Imagine such an evening from the perspective of an invited guest. The carriage arrives at the appointed hour, drawn by well-groomed horses, guided by a coachman in livery. The house blazes with light, every window illuminated, music drifting out into the night air. Inside, dozens or even hundreds of guests move through elegant rooms. The women in silk gowns with elaborate embroidery, the men in tailored coats and breeches, everyone performing the intricate social rituals that marked one as belonging to this privileged sphere. Conversation flowed around topics far removed from weather observations and oil consumption, political developments, business opportunities, European fashions, literary publications, the latest gossip about mutual acquaintances. For the men, these gatherings served partly as business networking, opportunities to cement alliances, to discuss potential ventures, to assess the reliability and resources of other merchants or planters. For the women, they offered chances to display accomplishment, to evaluate potential marriage partners, to maintain the complex web of social obligations that defined their class. In smaller communities, dances at country inns provided similar functions on a more modest scale. Local families gathered for evenings of dancing and dining, creating social cohesion within their communities, marking celebrations and seasons with collective entertainment. For the wealthy, leisure time brought other pursuits: reading books from personal libraries, writing lengthy letters to distant friends and relatives, taking walks in carefully landscaped gardens, attending lectures on scientific or philosophical topics, hosting intimate gatherings for conversation and music. In cities, theaters offered performances, though the early republic's theatrical culture remained less developed than what would emerge in later decades. The daily routine in prosperous urban households followed patterns wholly different from the lighthouse keeper's existence. The merchant rose at a leisurely hour, perhaps 8 o'clock, to a breakfast already prepared and laid out. He might scan newspapers, those expanding sources of information about distant events, while consuming his meal. His departure for the counting house occurred at a civilized hour, and his workday, while demanding in its own way, involved primarily mental labor calculation, negotiation, correspondence. He returned for dinner in the afternoon or early evening, a substantial meal taken with his family, perhaps with guests, served by domestic help who appeared, performed their duties, and withdrew. Evenings might be spent in the parlor, with his wife engaged in needlework, children at their studies, he himself perhaps reviewing accounts or reading. Or there might be a social engagement, a call to pay on another family, an invitation to dine elsewhere, a lecture to attend, a meeting of some voluntary association dedicated to civic improvement or charitable work. The wife's day consisted of supervision more than direct labor. She consulted with the cook about meals. She inspected the work of servants. She received social calls in her parlor during designated hours. She attended to correspondence. She oversaw her children's education or hired tutors to provide it. Her clothing required considerable maintenance. The elaborate dresses of the period needed regular cleaning, mending, updating to reflect current fashions. Children in these households lived lives carefully structured for their eventual assumption of adult responsibilities. Boys might attend academies or receive tutoring in classical languages, mathematics, history, preparing for entry to colleges like Harvard or Yale, or for apprenticeship to merchants or professionals. Girls learned accomplishments deemed suitable for their gender: music, drawing, French, needlework, along with the household management skills they would need as wives. Contrast this with the education available to a lighthouse keeper's children, if he had any perhaps basic literacy and numeracy taught by parents in spare moments, or seasonal attendance at a rural school when weather and farm work permitted, or in some cases, no formal education at all. The physical distance between the merchant's urban home and the keeper's coastal station might measure only tens of miles, but the social distance stretched immeasurably further. These were separate worlds, operating according to different principles, offering vastly different ranges of experience and possibility. The merchant participated in networks that spanned oceans. His decisions affected the employment of sailors, the profits of distant manufacturers, the availability of goods in foreign markets. He moved through spaces crowded with other people's streets, thronged with pedestrians and vehicles, counting houses busy with clerks, social gatherings filled with conversation and laughter. The lighthouse keeper's network consisted primarily of himself, occasionally extended by supply boat visits or messages from the lighthouse service. His decisions affected the safety of passing vessels, but he made them in isolation, without consultation or collaboration. He moved through spaces defined by emptiness, a vast ocean, the unpopulated shore, the solitary tower. The merchant worried about market fluctuations, business reverses, maintaining social position, providing adequately for his children's futures. The keeper worried about oil supplies, weather patterns, equipment maintenance, and the fundamental question of whether his light would burn through the night. When the merchant's wife died, as James Donahue's wife died at the South Haven Lighthouse, the merchant would be surrounded by family, friends, professional mourners, religious community. There would be an elaborate funeral, a substantial burial plot, condolence calls that might continue for weeks. When Donahue's wife died, he noted it in his log after the weather observations, and the next day he buried her himself, and that evening he lit the lamp, because the light must burn regardless of personal grief. Yet both the merchant and the keeper participated in the same national project: construction of the young republic's infrastructure and economy. The merchant's capital financed vessels that depended on the keeper's light for safe navigation. The keeper's labor protected the merchant's investments. They were connected, these two types of lives, even as they remained profoundly separate in their daily textures. The merchant class sometimes styled themselves as a leisure class, particularly in the South, where slavery enabled white families to avoid physical labor entirely. But leisure, in the early republic, remained relatively uncommon even among the wealthy. Most fortunes were recently made, requiring constant attention to maintain and expand. The truly idle rich, those who could live entirely on inherited wealth without active management, remained rare. The wealthy worked, but their work differed fundamentally from the keepers. The merchant managed risk, analyzed information, made strategic decisions that might prove profitable or ruinous. The keeper performed repetitive physical tasks according to established procedures, with little scope for decision-making beyond the immediate tactical concerns of weather and equipment. The merchant's work offered variety: different vessels, different cargoes, changing market conditions, evolving political situations. The keeper's work offered only small variations on a fundamentally unchanging theme: light the lamp, tend the flame, clean the glass, record the observations day after day, year after year. Leisure, for the wealthy, meant relief from the mental demands of business, opportunities for social interaction, and cultural refinement. Leisure, for the keeper, if such a concept applied at all, might mean only the brief periods between necessary tasks, moments to sit and gaze at the ocean, to think private thoughts, to exist without immediate demands on one's attention. Between the merchant elite and the isolated keepers existed another class, the domestic servants who made wealthy households function. These were primarily young women, some native-born and some, increasingly, immigrants from Ireland and elsewhere. They worked long hours for modest wages, rising before the family they served, retiring after them, subject to dismissal for minor infractions, or simply because their employer no longer needed them. Their lives bore certain similarities to lighthouse keepers' lives. Both involved repetitive labor, limited autonomy, relative isolation from broader society. A live-in servant experienced her own form of isolation, separated from family and community, existing within the household, but not fully part of the family. Her days followed routines as predictable as the keeper's fires to kindle, meals to prepare, cleaning to perform, all according to schedules set by others. Yet servants lived surrounded by wealth they could never hope to possess, performing labor that enabled others' leisure and social success. The keeper, at least, worked for himself in a sense, fulfilling a duty directly rather than enabling someone else's comfort. His isolation was geographic rather than social. He was not constantly reminded of class distinctions by daily proximity to those who lived entirely differently. As evening approaches in both worlds, in the merchant's comfortable house and at the lighthouse station, the divergence continues. In the city, lamps are lit throughout the household by servants, creating islands of warm light in multiple rooms. Dinner is served, family gathers, perhaps guests arrive for the evening. Conversation flows, plans are made, connections are maintained. At the lighthouse, the keeper climbs his solitary stairs, carrying his oil can. He pours, he trims, he lights the wicks. The lamp room glows into life, its beam reaching out across dark water toward vessels that carry, among other things, the commercial cargoes that sustain merchant fortunes. The merchant might glance out his window at the city night, the street lit by municipal lamps, windows glowing in neighboring houses, the distant sense of human presence all around. The keeper looks out at emptiness, the vast dark ocean, perhaps a distant vessel's light, the stars overhead in their slow rotation. Both sleep eventually, though differently. The merchant in a soft bed, in a warmed room, with his family nearby and servants on call, should any need arise. The keeper in his narrow bed, waking at intervals through the night to check the light, always half conscious of his duty, the awareness that lives might depend on his wakefulness. These parallel worlds persisted throughout the early republic worlds of wealth and isolation, society and solitude, comfort and duty. They were the same nation, the same historical moment, but experienced so differently that they might have been different centuries entirely. Yet both contributed to the slow construction of American infrastructure and society, one through capital and commerce, the other through patient vigilance and steady labor, each necessary, each playing its role in the larger story of the young republic finding its way forward through an uncertain age.